It turns out my expertise is on Russo-Chinese relations, and that's what I studied in graduate school. My dissertation was a history of their border from the Opium Wars, the mid-19th century, until Outer Mongolia was snatched from the Chinese sphere of influence and parked in the Russian sphere in the 1920s. So it's fun to talk about this particular topic. Before I get going, I'm going to do some terminology. I'm going to use the word Russia to refer to the Tsarist, Soviet, and modern periods, the same way that you use France to describe its many monarchies and many republics. The Bolsheviks thought they were special, so they came up with special words for special people. Soviet Union, but it turns out they were temporary and Russia is the enduring thing. So that's it on terminology. Before I speculate on what the future is going to look like, our only database that we have is whatever happened from this second backwards. What people call history, but it's just whatever is in the past, that's it. That's our database. And so I'm going to look at when Russia was strong and China was weak from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, then the reversal of the power balance, and then in the recent period when China has been strong and Russia weak. China and Russia actually discovered each other late in their histories. It was the early part of their last dynasties when the Russians were after fur, very lucrative in those days, and that brings them out to the Pacific. But their relations were only episodic until we get to the mid-19th century, which is where my story is going to begin. So in the 18th century, China was strong, Russia was weak, but that one doesn't last very long. And both empires followed the rules for continental empire. And if you want to survive in a continental world, that's what both of them historically have been. You don't want to have two front wars because you have multiple neighbors, any one of them that can come in at any time. And if they gang up on you, that's trouble. So you take on one at a time. Also, you don't want any great powers on the borders. This is the fundamental problem with their relationship, is because today's friend can be tomorrow's foe, and that's problematic. So what do you do to solve that problem? Well, you take on your neighbors sequentially, you set them up to fail, you destabilize the rising, ingest the failing, and you set up buffer zones in between. And you wait the opportune moment to pounce and absorb, and that is Vladimir Putin's game. But if you play this game, you're surrounding yourself by failing states because you're either busy destabilizing them or ingesting them. So the curious might ask, are Russia and China unlucky with all the very dysfunctional places that surround them, or are they complicit? Also, there are no enduring alliances in this world because the neighbors figure it out that the hegemonic power offers nothing but trouble in the long term. And there's also no counsel on when to stop expanding. So both Russia and China are known for overextending, overdoing it, and then that may help explain some of their periodic implosions over their long and bloody histories. Very high mortality rates. Before you dismiss this paradigm, you've seen it operating in real time in Syria and Ukraine. There are people who do this, and it also explains why all those ancient ruins are ruins. This sort of warfare is ruinous. But anyway, it lies at the basis of many of the great civilizations of Eurasia. This is how they did things. All right. So I'm going to start my story in the mid-19th century when the Chinese were beset by a whole series of rebellions that just about wrecked them. And the Russians take advantage of all of this. Remember the second rule of continental empires, no great power neighbors. And the Russians repeatedly derail the rise of China by scripting the Chinese to do things that are remarkably detrimental to Chinese interests, but pretty good for Russian interests. And it takes the Chinese a long time to figure it out. They have governments coming and going in this period. It's a difficult period, but they eventually figure it out by the time Mao reunifies China in 1949. So I'm going to go through each of those examples in turn, starting with a really big one, which are the Opium Wars. This is when Britain and France are coming at China in order to force China to trade on their terms. And this corresponds with the two biggest rebellions of China's period of rebellions, the Taiping and the Nian rebellion. So here's a big chart that's a simplified chart. The rebellions actually start in the late 18th centuries. The rebellion's a misnomer. These are civil wars. Either people are like minority peoples who want out of empire, they want to secede. Other people who want to overthrow the government in Beijing. The peak period is in red. The really big ones are in white. So China, it has got the two-front war problem, right? It's got Europeans coming at them plus all of this. In fact, the Chinese have so many fronts, they don't know how to deal with it. So the Russians come on into the Chinese and say, hey, we can deal with the British and French for you and solve that problem, and then you can deal with all the internal stuff. However, we need to have you sign a couple pieces of paper for us. The Treaty of Aigun of 1858, the Treaty of Peking of 1860, what do? They cede to Russia large swaths of territory in Central Asia and the Pacific coastline. And the Qing dynasty, they're vague on geography. They're beset by these other things. They don't understand that Europeans think these pieces of paper are permanent things. And they figure that once they put their house back in order, they're going to come back and get the territory later. Okay, the second example of ruinous Russian mediation that is going to keep China in turmoil. So in the first Sino-Japanese War, Japan trounces China, boots them from their tributary in Korea. And then the Japanese also want some territory on the Liaodong Peninsula. It isn't labeled very well there. But anyhow, what the Chinese do is they go to the Russians to help them counterbalance Japan so that Japan doesn't take this territory, Chinese territory in the Asian mainland. Russia gets its buddies, France and Germany, the so-called triple intervention, to gang up on Japan, and Japan looks at it, three great powers, I don't think so. So they bail. So from the Chinese point of view, so far so good, except what the Russians promptly do is take for themselves the very territory that had just been denied to Japan, and the story gets worse. Because all the European powers, or many of them, plus Japan come in and they carve out big concession areas throughout China so that China's not going to have full sovereignty over its territory for several generations, right? So instead of one relatively small Japanese concession area, they get foreigners everywhere. And so think about Second Rule Continental Empire, no great power neighbors, not happening while this is going on. Well, the Bolsheviks come to power, and then they're going to apply these rules as well. When they do come to power, they're very weak because Russia's been devastated by World War I. And then the Bolsheviks don't win their own bitter civil war until 1922. And so then as now, they relied on a really cheap but incredibly effective strategy of strategic communication. The Russians really understand other people's emotional life and what sets them at odds with each other, and they know just how to serve out the propaganda that sets people at each other's throats. And their propaganda is going to help the Chinese really despise the Japanese and the Europeans, while Russia's even greater predations, the ones you've already seen, go unnoticed. So here's Lev Karakhan. He was a deputy foreign minister. In 1919, he sends a missive, his Karakhan manifesto, to the Chinese foreign ministry, and he says, hey, we're not imperialists, we're Bolsheviks. We're going to return all the lands from those unequal treaties and be your friend from evermore. Unlike all the other evil imperialist powers, we're not like that anymore. And so the Chinese are looking at this and thinking, wow, here are the Bolsheviks who've gotten rid of their imperialistic government. They're putting together their shattered land. And so this offers hope to the Chinese that they can do likewise. And it's a model potentially to follow and a mentor who might help them. Except here's the detail. When the Bolsheviks started doing better in their civil war, they really dialed back what their offer was. The original offer was tear up treaties, China gets all territory back, no payments necessary. Under the new version of the Karakhan Manifesto, which the Russian Foreign Ministry goes and and telegraphs to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I've seen the document, or at least a certain copy of it in the archives in Taiwan. They send it back and say, we're willing to talk about these things. We're going to hold some negotiations. Well, the facts are they didn't return these concession areas to the mid-20th century, 1950s, after the Westerners had returned almost all of their concession areas. And this is not trivial. And when we think of concession areas in the age of imperialism in China, you think of British ones, right? Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong isn't actually very big. The reason you know about Hong Kong is it makes lots of money, or at least it used to. And the Russian concession areas were huge, didn't make money, nothing. What else is new? But the Russians had by far the largest concession area of any other country. But from the Karahan Manifesto is the origin of the myth of Sino-Soviet friendship, that the Russians somehow treated the Chinese nicely. And the foreign ministry officials who would have known better, their government is overthrown within the decade, and presumably these documents just gather dust in the archives. All right, my fourth example of derailing China's rise concerns the first united front between the Chinese Nationalist and Chinese Communist Party. Here's the leader of the Nationalist Party and also leader of its armies, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Well, he led the Northern Expedition, reunifying China, at least nominally, by either defeating or co-opting all those warlords there. You can see different colors of where the major warlords were. And previous South China attempts to do this or to secede from China, one or the other, had failed for lack of a proficient military. But Russia changes that. It provides aid, arms, and expertise and structures and things to found the Whampoa Military Academy, which is in Canton or Guangzhou. And that institution is going to educate the officers, both communist and nationalist, who would lead not only this, but some of their Civil War area officers that make this reunification of China possible. But the Russians had a price. Give the nationalists the aid, but the nationalists then have to let the communists into the Nationalist Party. That's what the United Front is. So this all coincides with a bitter succession struggle in Russia. This is the problem with dictatorships. They really don't do succession well. It's why elections are so convenient. Instead, you have Stalin and Trotsky going at it of which one was going to be the big cheese. Stalin is all about socialism in one country. He thinks that Russia ought to focus on its own internal development, whereas Trotsky says, nonsense. We need to focus on world revolution, because only if there are sister revolutions abroad can ours survive. So while this is all going on, the Chinese communists really want to get out of that united front. Why? Because it puts them in close proximity to the army, which is controlled by the nationalists, and they're getting worried whether they're about to get killed. And the Russians say, no, it's good. You stay in that united front. So they do. Chiang Kai-shek goes roaring up China. I've shown you the map. He reaches his pretty home base in Shanghai, pause, and he turns his guns on the communists and just massacres them in droves. And this is when Mao has to think of a rural strategy to power, because the urban strategy is no longer feasible. Well, once this happens, Stalin can use it to just trounce Trotsky in the internal power struggle, because it's, look, see, revolution in one country doesn't work abroad. And a lot of Chinese died, proving Stalin's point. All right. Another example where Russia literally derails the rise of China. There's a railway system there. We're going to talk rails. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, Japan wins it and gets from Russia, which built all these things in Chinese territory, the southern half of that railway net in lieu of an indemnity. Japan invests massively in railways, infrastructure, and apparently in local politicians. But the ruling warlord apparently wasn't sufficiently attentive to Japanese needs, so they assassinated him in 1928. So this is his son, Zhang Xueliang, who the following year, 1929, decides he wants his railways back from Russia. What does Russia do? It's not either version of the Karahan Manifesto. The Russians deploy over 100,000 troops, tanks, airplanes, the works, and just pound this man. And so the Russians keep their railways. So if you want to delay the rise of China, that sort of thing delays the rise of China. But now for the first rule of Continental Empire, no two-front wars. You move fast forward to the 1930s, and Stalin thinks he may very well face a two-front war with Germans in the West and Japanese in the East. Why would he think such thoughts? This thing, the Anti-Comintern Pact. Comintern is short for Communist International. It is the Soviet outreach program, and it's signed in 1936 between the Japanese and the Germans, and Stalin goes, uh-oh, they're after me. And so he plays every one of his China cards, and he holds lots of them, because then this is also part, if you want to disintegrate the neighbors in order to delay their rise, well, then you fund all sides of their civil wars and any side in between, because you just want them to go at it. So he plays every card he's got. And what he wants are the nationalists to stop fighting the communists, vice versa, and unite to fight the Japanese. And they're willing to do this provided Stalin provides conventional aid, which he does. But they think he's also going to provide soldiers. They don't get it. Once they're in, Russia is out of this thing. And Stalin's plan, his script for the Chinese and Japanese works beautifully, because when the nationalists unite in the Second United Front with the communists, going back to the dark side, the Japanese are apoplectic, and this is when they do the massive escalation in 1937, and they are off to overextension into parts due south of Russia. So this two-front Japanese-German war never materialized. Stalin, very successful. Chinese less so, because the Chinese are fighting the Japanese so the Russians don't have to, and that comes at the price of millions of deaths, millions of refugees. That does indeed derail China's rise yet again. Next example, per the Yalta Agreement, Russia finally gets in the war in Asia, about time. And in the very final weeks, and this August storm, when the Russians deploy like 1.5 million soldiers, it's one of the largest military operations of World War II. And then they rapidly take Manchuria, and they also do some, that would be the normal thing, but here's the abnormal thing. They also take away Manchuria's industrial base. That would not normally be what you do to someone. They take 83% of the electrical power equipment, take it home to Russia, not turning lights on in Manchuria, 86% of mining, 82% of cement making, 80% of metalworking equipment. Plus, they take 640,000 Japanese POWs to be slave labor for decades if they ever get home at all. And they also take the northern islands, which are still under dispute today. But if you think about it, if you're going to do indemnities or reparations or whatever this is, China had been fighting Japan in one form or another for 15 long years. Russia comes in at the cameo performance at the very end. So if there are indemnities to be paid for whatever Japan did in this war, surely China, not Russia, should have been the recipient for all this stuff. In addition, another example, not only does Stalin walk away with the industrial base, but he walks away with Mongolia as well. How does that work? The Yalta Agreement also stipulates that the status quo shall be maintained in Mongolia. So then you have to look at, well, what was the status quo? It was called Russian sphere of influence in the north, Chinese continuing control in the south. That Mongolia, which had always been both those places, had been part of the Qing Empire, had never been part of the Russian Empire. And moreover, Stalin had already taken Tanatuva in 1944, and it looks small on this map, but it's bigger than England, had lots of gold, which the Soviets had monetized long ago. So if you add up all the territory that the Russians took from the Chinese sphere of influence from the 1858 Treaty of Aigun and 1860 Treaty of Peking, fast forward to detaching Outer Mongolia from the Chinese sphere of influence, here's what it really is. It's greater than all U.S. territory east of the Mississippi. This is not your normal land grab. So talk about derailing somebody, that would do it.